Story 1: Slice of Death. The town of Black Hollow had always been a quiet place, nestled in the shadow of the Maine woods like a forgotten secret. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where the streets were empty by 9, and where the most exciting thing to happen in a decade was the annual Pumpkin Festival. But that all changed when Slice of Heaven opened its doors on the corner of Main and Elm. The sign above the door was simple, almost humble, with its cursive lettering and a cartoon pizza slice winking at passers-by. The smell, though, that was anything but humble. It wafted through the streets like a siren's call, rich and savory, with a hint of something smoky, something primal. It was the kind of smell that made your stomach growl even if you'd just eaten, the kind that made you forget your worries and follow your nose like a bloodhound on a trail. The first day, the lines stretched around the block. "Best pizza I've ever had," said Old Man Haggerty, who hadn't left his house in years except to buy lottery tickets. He was sitting on a bench outside the shop, grease dripping down his chin, his eyes half-lidded with pleasure. "You gotta try it." And try it they did. By the end of the week, Slice of Heaven was the talk of the town. The crust was perfectly crispy, the sauce was tangy and sweet, the cheese was gooey and golden, and the toppings, oh, the toppings. They were fresh, they were flavorful, they were perfect. But it wasn't just the taste. There was something else, something people couldn't quite put their finger on. Something that made them come back, again and again, even when their wallets were empty and their stomachs were full. It wasn't long before the changes started. The first to notice was Becky Simmons, the town's hairdresser. She'd been a regular at Slice of Heaven since day one, often stopping by for a slice on her lunch break. But one morning, as she stood in front of the mirror in her salon, she noticed something strange. Her eyes, usually a bright, clear blue, looked darker, almost black. She blinked, rubbed at them, even tried eye drops, but the darkness remained. "Must be the lighting," she muttered, though she didn't believe it. A few days later, her skin started to gray. At first, it was subtle, just a faint pallor, like she hadn't been sleeping well. But by the end of the week, her complexion was the color of ash, and her hands felt cold to the touch. "You feeling okay, Becky?" asked Mrs. Henderson, one of her regulars. "Fine," Becky replied, though her voice was hollow, distant. Just fine. But she wasn't fine. None of them were. By the second week, the changes were impossible to ignore. People who had been eating at Slice of Heaven, and only those people, were turning gray, their eyes black as coal. They moved slowly, deliberately, like they were conserving energy. And they whispered, always whispering. "The oven," they'd say, their voices low and raspy. "The oven in the basement." At first, no one paid much attention. Black Hollow was a small town, and small towns loved their gossip. But as more and more people began to change, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "The oven," they'd say, their black eyes gleaming. "It needs to be fed." Tommy Grady was the first to investigate. He was a curious kid, 12 years old with a mop of red hair and a knack for getting into trouble. He'd heard the whispers, seen the changes, and he wasn't about to let something this strange go unchecked. One night, after his parents had gone to bed, Tommy snuck out of the house and made his way to Slice of Heaven. The shop was closed, the windows dark, but the smell of pizza still lingered in the air, thick and heavy. Tommy crept around to the back of the building, where a rusty metal door led to the basement. The door was unlocked. Tommy's heart pounded as he pushed it open, the hinges squealing in protest. The stairs were steep and narrow, the air damp and cold. He pulled out his flashlight and pointed it down into the darkness. The basement was small, cluttered with boxes and crates. But in the center of the room, dominating the space, was the oven. It was massive, ancient, its iron surface pitted and scarred. The door was shut, but Tommy could feel the heat radiating from it, could hear the faint crackle of flames inside. And there was something else. A smell, sharp and metallic, that made his stomach turn. "Hello," Tommy called, his voice trembling. There was no answer. He stepped closer, his flashlight beam dancing over the oven's surface. There were markings etched into the iron, strange, twisting symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the light. Tommy reached out to touch them, But before he could, the oven door flew open with a deafening clang. The heat hit him like a wall, forcing him to stumble back. The flames inside were impossibly bright, impossibly hot, and they roared like a living thing. And then, from deep within the oven, came a voice, low, guttural, and filled with hunger. "Feed me!" Tommy screamed and turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind him. The flames surged forward, wrapping around him like tendrils, pulling him into the oven. His screams echoed through the basement, then faded into silence. The oven door closed with a soft click. The next morning, Slice of Heaven opened as usual. The smell of pizza filled the air, and the line stretched around the block. But Tommy Grady was nowhere to be found. His parents reported him missing, of course, and the police searched the town from top to bottom. But no one thought to check the basement of Slice of Heaven. No one dared. The changes continued. More people turned gray, their eyes black, their whispers growing louder. "The oven," they said. "It needs to be fed." And then, one by one, they began to disappear. By the end of the month, half the town was gone. The streets were empty, the houses dark and silent. The only sound was the whisper of the wind through the trees, carrying with it the smell of pizza, rich, savory, and irresistible. In the basement of Slice of Heaven, the oven burned on, its flames roaring with a hunger that could never be satisfied. And somewhere, deep within its iron belly, Tommy Grady and the others waited, their black eyes gleaming in the dark. "Feed me," the oven whispered, its voice echoing through the empty streets. And the town, what was left of it, obeyed. Story 2: The Man Who Orders the Same Thing Every Night. The first time Joey saw the order come in, he didn't think much of it. A large pepperoni pizza, extra crispy crust, no garlic, prepaid. The instructions were the only odd thing. Leave it on the porch. Don't knock. Don't look inside the window. At Murphy's Pizzeria, weird requests weren't exactly uncommon. People had all sorts of superstitions about their food. Some wanted their cheese arranged in a pentagram, satanic teens probably. Others swore their pizza had to be baked exactly 13 minutes. But this one was different, because it happened every single night. The order came in at exactly 9:15 p.m. The address never changed, 44 Ashbrook Lane. The house was old, the kind of place that looked abandoned in the daylight and haunted at night. It sat at the end of a lonely street, tucked between two burned-out lots. No lights, no car in the driveway, just that sagging front porch with its rotten wooden planks, and the dark window beside the door. Joey had been delivering pizzas for almost 2 years, and in all that time, he had never seen anyone at that house. He followed the rules at first, dropped the box on the porch, never knocked, never looked. But after weeks of this, his curiosity started eating at him. Who the hell was ordering all these pizzas? He asked the other drivers, but they all shrugged. Some recluse, probably a shut-in. But Joey couldn't shake the feeling that something about this was wrong. One night, he decided to test a boundary. He knocked, just once. A soft rap against the peeling wood of the door. No answer. He stepped back, waiting. His pulse ticked up. Nothing. With a nervous chuckle, he turned away, feeling silly, until he heard it. A sound from inside. A soft, wet chewing sound, like someone was gnawing on raw meat. He bolted back to his car, tires screeching as he tore out of there, breath coming hard. That was it. That was enough. The next night, though, at exactly 9:15 p.m., the order came in again. It went on for weeks. Then one night, Joey made a mistake. He was covering an extra shift, exhausted, not thinking. When he reached the house, he bent down to place the pizza on the porch, and his gaze flicked, just for a second, toward the window. At first, he thought it was just the darkness playing tricks on him. Then he saw it. A face. Pale. Wrong. Not a face, really, but the outline of one. Where the eyes should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. But the mouth, Christ, the mouth was huge. A gaping, jagged smile, filled with rows upon rows of teeth. It grinned at him, lips peeling back, too wide, too hungry. Then it moved, a shuddering, unnatural lurch toward the glass. Joey stumbled backward, his breath hitched in his throat. The thing inside the house pressed itself against the window, grinning. He ran. Joey didn't go back to work after that. The pizzeria called him. "We need you to cover deliveries." He ignored them. His phone rang, unknown caller. He didn't answer. A text buzzed in at 9:15 p.m. "You looked." He threw his phone across the room. For the next 3 nights, he didn't sleep. He barricaded his door, kept every light in his apartment on. But the feeling never left him. The awful certainty that he had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. Then, on the 4th night, a knock at his door. Not a polite one. A slow, deliberate knock. Rap, rap, rap. His breath caught in his throat. He knew before he even reached the peephole. It was outside. Joey backed away, heart hammering, pressing himself against the wall. The knock came again, harder. Then the door handle jiggled, and he heard the whisper. "You looked." He squeezed his eyes shut, hands clamped over his mouth. Not real. Something scratched at the door. Long, scraping fingers. The whispering grew louder. Then, silence. The next morning, he found a pizza box sitting on his doorstep. No return address. No note. Just a greasy cardboard box. The Murphy's Pizzeria logo smiling up at him. His stomach turned. Joey picked it up with shaking hands, heart slamming against his ribs. He didn't want to open it. Didn't want to know. But he did. Inside was raw meat, and underneath it, a set of human teeth. The neon sign buzzed like a dying wasp, flickering in the rain-soaked darkness. Tony's Pizzeria, it read in jagged red letters, though the T had long since burned out, leaving only Oni's Pizzeria to greet the occasional passerby. The shop sat on the edge of Derry, Maine, a town that had seen better days. The kind of town where businesses came to die, where the streets were empty after sundown, and where the shadows seemed to stretch just a little longer than they should. Tony's Pizzeria was no exception. Once a bustling hub of late-night cravings and family dinners, it had fallen on hard times. The competition from chain restaurants, the rising cost of ingredients, and the general decline of the town had left it teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Tony himself, a balding, paunchy man with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, had tried everything to keep the place afloat. Discounts, coupons, loyalty programs. Nothing worked, until he remembered the old policy. 30 minutes or free, Tony muttered to himself one night, staring at the peeling wallpaper in the back office. It had been a gimmick back in the 80s, a way to compete with the big chains. But it had been abandoned after a string of accidents. Drivers speeding, running red lights, getting into wrecks. The lawsuits had nearly sunk the place. But now, desperate times called for desperate measures. "We're bringing it back," Tony announced to his staff the next morning. There were only 3 of them left. Marty, the doughy, perpetually nervous delivery driver. Lisa, the cashier with the too bright smile and the dead eyes. And Carlos, the cook who never spoke and always seemed to be staring at something no one else could see. 30 minutes or free, Tony repeated, slapping a flyer down on the counter. "Starting today, we'll put these up all over town. It'll bring in business. Trust me." Marty shifted uncomfortably. Boss, isn't that like dangerous? I mean, what if I get stuck in traffic or something?" Tony waved a hand dismissively. "You'll figure it out. Just drive faster and avoid the cops." Lisa giggled, a high, nervous sound that made Marty's skin crawl. Carlos just stared at the flyer, his expression unreadable. The first few days went surprisingly well. The flyers brought in a flood of orders, and Marty managed to make most of the deliveries on time. The customers were thrilled, the money was rolling in, and Tony started to think maybe, just maybe, the place could be saved. But then things started to go wrong. It began with the whispers. Marty was the first to hear them. He'd be driving down some dark, empty street, the pizza warmers rattling in the back of his beat-up Honda, when he'd hear it, a faint, raspy voice, just barely audible over the hum of the engine. 30 minutes or else. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, the stress of the job getting to him. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until he couldn't ignore them. 30 minutes or else, and then there were the shadows. They moved at the edge of his vision, flickering in the rearview mirror, darting across the road ahead. At first, they were small, indistinct, but as the days went on, they grew larger, more defined. Shapes, figures, watching him, following him. Marty tried to tell Tony, but the boss just laughed it off. "You're working too hard," Tony said, clapping Marty on the shoulder. "Take a break. Have a slice. You'll feel better." But Marty didn't feel better. He felt worse. The first disappearance happened on a Thursday. Marty had been out on a delivery, racing against the clock as usual, when he got a call from Tony. "Where the hell are you?" Tony barked. "You've got 5 minutes left on this order." "I'm almost there," Marty said, his voice trembling. "But something's wrong. The shadows, they're everywhere. And the whispers, I can't." The line went dead. Marty never made it to the customer's house. His car was found abandoned on the side of the road, the engine still running, the pizza warmers full of cold, uneaten pies. There was no sign of Marty. Tony tried to brush it off. "Probably just quit," he said, though his hands were shaking. "You know how kids are these days." But Lisa wasn't convinced. She'd heard the whispers too, seen the shadows, and she'd noticed something else, something that made her blood run cold. The customers, they were changing. It started with their eyes. Lisa was the first to notice it. A regular customer, old Mrs. Henderson, came in to pick up an order. She was her usual chatty self, asking about the weather, the town, the latest gossip. But when she turned to leave, Lisa caught a glimpse of her eyes in the flickering neon light. They were blank, soulless, like two black holes staring out from her wrinkled face. Lisa blinked, and the moment passed. Mrs. Henderson's eyes were normal again, bright and twinkling. But the image stayed with Lisa, haunting her dreams. And then there were the drivers. Tony hired a replacement for Marty, a kid named Jake, fresh out of high school and desperate for work. He lasted 2 days. On his third delivery, Jake showed up at the customer's door with a pizza in one hand and a blank, empty stare on his face. "Here's your pizza," he said, his voice flat and lifeless. 30 minutes or else." The customer, a young mother with a baby on her hip, took the pizza and slammed the door in Jake's face. She didn't notice the way his eyes glinted in the darkness, or the way his shadow seemed to stretch and twist as he walked back to his car. Jake never came back to the shop. By the end of the week, Tony was running out of drivers and customers. The ones who still came in were different, pale, hollow-eyed, their movements slow and deliberate. They whispered to each other in low, raspy voices, their words barely audible over the hum of the pizza ovens. 30 minutes or else. Tony tried to ignore it to focus on the business. But the shadows were everywhere now, creeping in from the edges of the shop, pooling in the corners, stretching across the floor. And the whispers, they were inside his head, echoing in his thoughts, drowning out everything else. 30 minutes or else. He tried to shut it down, to close the shop and walk away. But every time he reached for the keys, something stopped him. A cold hand on his shoulder, a voice in his ear. "You made a promise." And then there was Carlos. The cook had always been quiet, but now he was silent. He moved through the kitchen like a ghost, his eyes fixed on some distant point, his hands working the dough with mechanical precision. But there was something wrong with the pizzas he made. Something off. The cheese was too stringy, the sauce too red, the crust too alive. Tony tried to confront him, to ask what was going on. But Carlos just stared at him, his eyes black and empty, and whispered a single word: "Feed." The end came on a cold, rainy night. Tony was alone in the shop, the last of the staff gone, the last of the customers vanished. The shadows filled the room, pressing in on him from all sides, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. 30 minutes or else. He stumbled into the kitchen, his heart pounding, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Carlos was there, standing in front of the oven, his back to Tony. "Carlos," Tony croaked. "What's going on? What are you?" Carlos turned, and Tony's words died in his throat. The cook's eyes were gone, replaced by two black, gaping holes. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque, toothless grin. "You made a promise?" Carlos whispered, his voice echoing in Tony's mind. 30 minutes or else." The oven door creaked open, revealing a yawning, fiery abyss. The heat was unbearable, the flames roaring like a living thing. And from deep within the oven, Tony heard the voices, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all whispering the same thing. 30 minutes or else. He tried to run, but the shadows were everywhere, wrapping around him like tendrils, pulling him toward the oven. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the flames. The last thing he saw was Carlos's grinning face, his black eyes gleaming with something like hunger. "Feed," the cook whispered, and then Tony was gone. The next morning, the neon sign buzzed to life, its red letters flickering in the dawn light. Oni's Pizzeria was open for business. The customers came, pale and hollow-eyed, their whispers filling the air. 30 minutes or else. And in the kitchen, Carlos stood in front of the oven, his hands working the dough with mechanical precision, his black eyes fixed on some distant point. The pizzas were perfect, and the oven was always hungry,